This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. This is week 3 of the series that we are doing on what we believe, based on a series of lessons that I gave in 2020 during the midst of the pandemic. That I had to do this virtually. I was the interim youth director at the church that I attend right now. They were trying to find a new student ministries director, and for about 6 months, I filled in for the position there until they could find someone, and they did find someone who was really great. So it all wound up working out for us, but the series is called What We Believe, and we are on the 3rd week of that series where we're taking a look at what Paul means by the gospel. And we're looking at the phrase son of David that Paul uses in Romans chapter 1. So I really hope that you guys enjoy this episode and the introductions that I've been giving to all of these. You might be wondering, if you're watching on YouTube, why is it that week in and week out, Alex is wearing the exact same hoodie that he wore the week before? And that's because I'm recording all of these introductions on the same day. Now, I'm probably not going to get to all 7 of them today, but I do plan on doing 1 or 2 more. So if you're watching on YouTube, all of the introductions, you will see me wearing the exact same hoodie. But if you are watching the original videos, you're following through, you will see that my haircut by this point in the series has gotten just out of control, ridiculous. I think week 4 is the absolute worst because I think I shaved my beard off after week 4. I hope I shaved my beard off after week 4. But my haircut was terrible because our governor, Andy Beshear, had made it illegal for anyone that wanted to cut hair to do their job. And so no one could get a haircut in Kentucky at this time. And it was really, really annoying and also somewhat embarrassing. But I'm giving it to you because I really think that this content's important. So I hope that you guys enjoy week 3 of our What Do We Believe series, where we talk about what it means for Jesus to be the son of David. Guys, enjoy this episode. Hi, guys. I hope everyone is doing all right this week. We are in the 3rd week of our series called What Do We Believe, where we're looking at what exactly it is that we as Christians believe. So we found out in the 1st week that Paul, when he's writing his letter to the Romans, in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, explains that the beliefs or the teachings of the earliest followers of Jesus were called the gospel. And gospel is a term that means good news. And so we use that term gospel to describe what it is that we believe. So last week, we started breaking down what Paul says in Romans 1, 1 through 5, and we see that for Paul, the gospel is based on the story of the Old Testament. Paul says that his gospel is according to Scripture, meaning that the entire story of the Old Testament is fulfilled in Jesus. So this week, we're going to take a look at Romans chapter 1, verse 3, and we're going to talk about the next part of Paul's Gospels. Very appropriate considering that we are in Holy Week, the week before Easter. Paul says this, that the gospel concerns God's Son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh. So there are 2 terms here that we need to break down to understand what Paul means. So he says that Jesus, or that his gospel, which is about Jesus, has to do with the fact that Jesus is the Son of God and that Jesus is a descendant of David. So what do those 2 terms mean? Now remember, we said last week in our lesson on According to Scripture that when Paul thinks about Jesus, he thinks about Jesus as fulfilling the story of the entire Old Testament. And if we go back to one of the most important passages in the Old Testament, a passage called a passage from 2 Samuel, at 2 Samuel chapter 7, God makes a promise to this king named David. And David is kind of like the greatest king in all of Israel's history. So God promises David in 2 Samuel chapter 7 that one of David's descendants will be given an everlasting kingdom and will rule over the whole world. So God makes this huge promise or covenant with David that one of David's descendants will one day rule over the entire world, and his kingdom or his rule will last forever. So throughout the rest of the Old Testament, when you look at the prophets and some of the other writings in the Old Testament, all of those writers are looking back to that promise in 2 Samuel 7 and wondering when exactly it was that God was going to raise up this son of David? When exactly was it that God is going to bring about this everlasting kingdom that comes from David's family? So they begin to use terms, things like Son of God, Son of Man, Messiah. Those kinds of terms describe this coming descendant of David who will be king over the entire world and rescue Israel. So that term Son of God that Paul uses in Romans chapter 1 verse 3 actually comes from primarily the Psalms. So if we take a look at the second Psalm, Psalm 2, the term Son of God is a title that refers to the King of Israel. And it's such an important term that I think it's going to be beneficial for us to read the passage. So if you want to follow along at home, this is Psalm chapter 2. And then the psalmist begins by writing in the first couple of verses that the nations are in an uproar, that all of the kings of the earth are fighting against the Lord and fighting against the people of the Lord. And then the writer of Psalm 2 says this about God. He who sits in the heavens laughs, that's God, is laughing at the nations. The Lord scoffs at them. Then the Lord will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king, that is the son of David, upon Zion and my holy mountain. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. So in the ancient world, when Psalm 2 is written, usually the term Son of God would describe someone who was literally a descendant of a god. So someone who had like a semi-divine or semi-godlike quality about them. But in Psalm chapter 2, they're talking, in Psalm chapter 2, the writer of the Psalms is saying that this Son of God is this coming descendant of David. And it's not so much that that person is divine necessarily, but that he is a representative of God, that he's the Son of God because God is working through him to fulfill his plans for the world. So that term Son of God has a lot to do with the fact that this coming Son of David, who is going to establish an everlasting kingdom, will rule in a way that represents the rule and the wisdom of God. This will be the kind of king that God always intended for the world to have. So when we look at the Gospels, when we look at the actual stories of Jesus, when you read, like in Matthew chapter 3, the story of the baptism of Jesus, when Jesus is baptized by John, the voice from heaven, the voice of God, actually quotes Psalm 2 and says that this is my son, meaning that Jesus is the coming descendant of David. And if you read the Gospels, the fact that Jesus is this coming king, that Jesus is the son of David, they're all over the place. And last Sunday was Palm Sunday, where we celebrate Jesus' entry into Jerusalem the week before he dies. And everyone that sees Jesus go into Jerusalem is basically, they're more or less saying that this is the coming king, this is the son of David. They're dropping palm branches in the road. In other words, saying that Jesus is the coming king. And Paul says that without any sort of ambiguity or without any sort of question, that Jesus is the promised king, Jesus is the promised descendant of David, that Jesus is the true king. He is the Son of God. And we're going to see that in his resurrection, Jesus kind of finally meets that status. And we'll take a look at that next week. So I want to reflect on that a little bit going into Easter this week. So I have 3 questions for you this week that we're going to discuss at youth group on Sunday night. Number 1, we don't often think about Jesus as being an actual king. How should this change the way that we look at Jesus? So if we believe that Jesus is literally the king that was promised to David, how does that change the way that we understand who he is and who his identity is? What does that do for our understanding of Jesus? Number 2, if Jesus is king, why does that mean that we as his people should be obedient to him? So why is it important, if Jesus is truly the king over the world, why is it important that we should be obedient to him? And then number 3, if we believe that Jesus is the real king, does this shape or change the way that we look at political leaders and rulers around the world today? And if it does change that, how so? So again, as Christians, if we believe that Jesus is the real king, how does that change the way that we think about like political leaders and about the people that are in power and in authority today? Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.